Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was a calm, peaceful morning when Greg and his friend Charlie set out for their usual weekend fishing trip. They had fished this secluded lake for years, always enjoying the serenity and solitude it offered. That day, though, something felt different. The air was unnaturally still, and the usual sounds of birds and rustling trees were oddly absent. Still, they dismissed the feeling and pushed off in their boat, eager to catch something. As they drifted farther out, Greg noticed something strange near the shoreline. A figure, pale and almost translucent, stood at the water's edge. It looked like a man, but it had an unsettling quality to it. Its skin appeared stretched tight over its bones, and its face was distorted, like it had been underwater too long. Charlie didn't seem to notice. Greg called out to him, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. "Did you see that?" Greg asked, his voice tight. Charlie glanced over and shook his head. "Nah, man, probably just a trick of the light. Relax." But Greg couldn't shake the feeling. It gnawed at him, a deep primal dread that seemed to sink into his bones. They continued to fish, but the odd stillness hung over them. The silence was suffocating. The water, usually a deep blue, had turned a murky green. Every once in a while, Greg thought he saw something moving beneath the surface, but when he looked, it was gone. Then the boat lurched, hard. Greg was thrown forward, nearly crashing into the edge. "What the hell?" he shouted, his heart racing. Charlie steadied himself, looking around, but there was nothing. The water was still, nothing but the occasional ripple from the faintest breeze. But then, as if in answer to his frustration, something broke the surface, a hand. A pale, waterlogged hand, slick with the slickness of the lake, reached up from the depths. It grasped the side of the boat, long fingers curling like claws, and slowly a face emerged from the water. Greg froze. It was the figure from the shore, but now its face was inches from his. The eyes were wide open, black and endless, and it grinned, an expression of pure malice. The water poured off its face, revealing gaping holes where its cheeks should have been. It had no nose, only blackened, swollen skin. Greg screamed and pushed back, his hand fumbling for the oars, but Charlie, now pale as death, was already rowing frantically. "What the hell is that thing?" he gasped. The creature wasn't done. It rose from the water, impossibly tall, and with a swift motion it reached for the boat. The lake bubbled and churned beneath it, as though something massive and hungry lurked below. They managed to get some distance, but the boat didn't feel right. It was sluggish, almost as if something was weighing it down. Charlie looked over his shoulder. "We need to get out of here, now." As they paddled with all their strength, Greg felt a cold, wet sensation around his feet. Something was beneath the boat, pushing up against the bottom, trying to flip them over. It was as if the lake itself had turned hostile, alive with malevolent intent. Suddenly, the water exploded, and a massive twisted shape shot out, grabbing the boat's side. The thing was huge, its form a grotesque mixture of human and fish-like features, scales slick and dripping with water. Its arms were long, impossibly so, ending in webbed fingers with sharp claws. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of teeth that looked far too many for any creature. It screamed, a deep gurgling sound that filled the air. Greg and Charlie barely managed to escape, but the lake was no longer the place of peace it had once been. They didn't even look back when they finally reached the shore. The nightmares would haunt them both for years to come. Every time they closed their eyes, they would see that face, grinning from beneath the water, reaching for them with those long, terrible fingers. And sometimes, just sometimes, in the dead of night, they could still hear the sound of something splashing beneath the surface, waiting.
Story number 2.
It was late in the fall when Amanda and her husband Jason decided to visit a remote, secluded cabin nestled deep in the forest for a weekend getaway. They had rented it from an old, local man who seemed a little off, but assured them the cabin was perfect for a peaceful retreat. They didn't mind the oddities about the place, such as the fact that the cabin hadn't been used in years and had a strange, musty odor, but they were looking forward to some peace and quiet away from the bustle of city life. As night fell, Jason lit a fire in the cabin's old stone fireplace while Amanda set the table for dinner. The wind howled outside and the trees shook violently, casting eerie shadows through the windows. Amanda felt uneasy, but she brushed it off. After all, it was just the wind and the unfamiliar isolation of the cabin. They sat down to eat, and as they spoke, Amanda noticed a faint tapping sound coming from the walls. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the old structure settling. But it didn't stop. It grew louder and more persistent, a soft knock, followed by another and then more, until it sounded like multiple people were knocking from within the walls themselves. Jason, not one to believe in superstitions, shrugged it off. "It's probably just rodents or something," he said. But Amanda wasn't convinced. Something about the sound unsettled her, as though something was trying to get in. She glanced nervously at the door and windows, but everything appeared normal. The tapping continued for hours, growing in intensity until it almost seemed like a rhythmic chant. Amanda's nerves were on edge, her stomach tightening. "What if something's trapped inside the walls?" she whispered to Jason. He laughed, a little too loudly. "There's nothing in there, Amanda. You're just hearing things." But then, in the dead of night, the tapping stopped, abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Amanda's pulse quickened, her mind racing. Jason was already asleep, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something far beyond her understanding. She got up, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination running wild. But as she stood by the wall, she heard something, soft whispers, muffled, as though coming from the inside of the cabin's walls. Panic gripped her chest. She hurried back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The whispers grew louder and more distinct, now accompanied by scratching sounds, agonizing, desperate, like fingernails dragging against the wooden beams. The next morning, Jason woke up to Amanda's trembling form sitting in a corner of the room. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with terror. "Jason, something's wrong," she gasped. "There's something in the walls." He tried to calm her down, but deep down, a cold knot formed in his gut. They went outside to inspect the cabin's exterior, but everything appeared normal. Nothing could explain the sounds she had heard. They decided to leave, but as Jason grabbed their things, Amanda froze, staring at the far corner of the room. "The walls," she whispered. Jason turned around, and in that moment, a low, grating sound started to rise from the walls, like something was scratching at the inside, moving just beneath the surface. He watched in horror as cracks appeared in the wooden paneling, splitting wider with every passing second. Then, with a loud splintering noise, the wall burst open. A grotesque, misshapen creature, covered in dark, rotting skin, crawled out from the inside. It had no eyes, only dark, empty sockets, and its mouth opened impossibly wide, dripping with saliva as it screeched inhumanly. It moved toward them with startling speed, its long, sharp fingers reaching out like claws, leaving a trail of blood as it dragged its gnarled body out of the hole. Amanda screamed, grabbing Jason's arm, but the creature's mouth widened even further, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Just before it could reach them, the door slammed open, and the local man they had rented the cabin from appeared in the doorway, his face twisted in a strange expression. "You shouldn't have stayed," he muttered. "They don't like it when people stay too long." With that, he grabbed the creature, pulling it back into the wall with ease, as though it were nothing more than a doll. As the wall closed up, Amanda and Jason were left standing in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what had just happened. They didn't speak a word as they left the cabin. The image of the creature still burned in their minds. The drive back was long and quiet, but as they passed the edge of the forest, Amanda could have sworn she saw a pair of empty, hollow eyes staring at her from the trees, just beyond the edge of the road. She couldn't forget the whispers, the scratching, the feeling that something was watching them. And that night, when she closed her eyes, the last thing she saw before drifting into a restless sleep was that same empty-eyed creature standing in the shadows of the cabin, waiting.
Story number 3.
Lena had always been a skeptic, especially when it came to ghost stories. She'd heard her share of chilling tales over the years, but nothing ever really made her believe in the supernatural. That was until she took a job as a night shift nurse at a small, isolated hospital in a rural town. The hospital was old, dating back to the 1920s, and had a history of strange events. The staff talked about it in hushed tones, but Lena wasn't one to be swayed by gossip. The building had seen its fair share of deaths over the years, and she chalked up any eerie occurrences to the hospital's age or the overactive imaginations of her coworkers. One particularly cold winter night, Lena was assigned to the ER's night shift. It was just her and a few other nurses, along with a skeleton crew of doctors. The rest of the hospital was eerily quiet, empty, and dark, except for the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Most of the patients were sleeping, leaving her with little to do but monitor the machines and occasionally check in on the rooms. Around 2 a.m., a man was rushed in with severe injuries after a car accident. He was unconscious and covered in cuts and bruises. Lena helped stabilize him and placed him in one of the rooms. The sound of the monitors beeping, along with the rhythmic hum of the hospital, created an odd sense of calm. As she went to check on another patient in a nearby room, Lena noticed something peculiar. There was a dark figure standing at the end of the hall. The figure was tall, its features shadowed by the dim light. She didn't think much of it at first, probably a nurse on the same shift or even a patient wandering. But when she walked closer, it was gone. Shrugging it off, she continued her rounds, but the figure appeared again, standing in the same spot, just out of view. This time, it was clearer, like a silhouette. It didn't move, just stood still, its presence unnervingly oppressive. Lena's heart rate quickened. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks, fatigue, maybe, but as she approached it, she froze. There was a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves, something incomprehensible. Then, in the faintest of movements, the figure tilted its head, just slightly. Her breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively took a step back. The figure didn't move. Not knowing what else to do, she decided to check the security cameras to see if anyone was actually in the hallway. But when she pulled up the footage, the hallway was completely empty. No one had walked down that section of the hospital for hours. Confused, Lena went back to the hallway to investigate further, but this time, the figure wasn't just standing at the end. It was closer, far closer. The figure stood just a few feet away from her, its shadow so dark it seemed to consume the surrounding light. "Who's there?" she whispered, but the figure didn't respond. The whispering grew louder, clearer. It sounded like voices, dozens of them, murmuring in languages she didn't understand. Panic rose in her chest. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead. The figure stepped closer, so close that she could feel its cold breath on her skin. Its face was hidden in shadow, but she could sense it was smiling, a smile full of malice. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into thin air. Lena ran back to the nurse's station, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to tell herself it was a hallucination brought on by stress, but the unease that settled in her stomach refused to go away. When she spoke to the other nurses about what she had seen, they didn't look at her with skepticism. Instead, they nodded quietly. "That's the one of them said, her voice low. "He's been here for years." Lena asked what she meant, and the nurse explained that the hospital had a long, tragic history of deaths, especially in the old section of the building. There was a patient, long before Lena's time, who had died in that very hall. His name was Thomas. His death had been violent, unexplained, and surrounded by rumors of strange occurrences, but his body was never found. People said his spirit still wandered the halls, lingering around the places where he had died. The rest of the shift was uneventful, but Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She went home, but sleep didn't come easy. That night, in the quiet of her apartment, she heard it, a whisper, faint and distant, as if someone was calling her name. She tried to ignore it, but the voice grew louder and clearer, more insistent. Lena sat up, heart racing. The whisper was coming from inside the walls.
Story number 4.
It was just another late evening when Ben decided to visit his childhood home. He had recently moved back to town after years of living abroad and wanted to check in on the old house, which had been sold shortly after his family moved away. Though it was abandoned, the house always felt strangely familiar to him, with the familiar creaking floors and dust-covered furniture, as though the memories lingered in every corner. His parents had always warned him about the house, the strange things that had happened there. As a kid, he'd brushed it off as just a story, a way to explain why they had to leave so suddenly. Now, with the house standing empty before him, the weight of those old tales seemed to resurface. He approached the front door, which creaked open with little effort, and stepped inside. The musty scent of old wood and forgotten memories filled his nostrils, and the silence was almost deafening. The dim light filtering through the cracked windows only made the place feel even more suffocating, like something was watching him from the shadows. Ben hadn't been inside in years, but everything felt so familiar. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, the same as they always had, but there was something different now. The house felt colder, as though the temperature dropped the moment he crossed the threshold. He decided to take a walk through the old rooms, wanting to revisit the past, even if it made him uneasy. When he reached the staircase, he felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about the stairs. He'd always hated climbing them. As a child, they were the pathway to the attic, a place his parents had forbidden him to explore. They said it was unsafe, filled with old boxes and junk, but there was a part of him that always wondered about it. That night, something about the attic seemed to call to him. The pull was inexplicable. Without thinking, he ascended the stairs, the old wooden steps groaning under his weight. He reached the door to the attic, and, despite the knot in his stomach, he opened it. The air up there was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew, and as his flashlight illuminated the room, Ben could see the piles of old furniture, boxes, and forgotten memories. But it wasn't the clutter that caught his attention. It was the small figure standing in the corner. At first, he thought it was just an old mannequin or some forgotten decoration. But then the figure moved. Slowly, unnaturally, it shifted, and Ben's heart skipped a beat. The figure was dressed in ragged clothes, the fabric torn and stained with something dark, something that looked disturbingly like blood. Ben's pulse raced as he backed away, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him with empty, hollow eyes. He couldn't look away. There was something mesmerizing about the figure, something that made him feel as if it were waiting for him, as if it had been waiting for years. His mind screamed at him to leave, to get out of the house, but his body wouldn't respond. Then, without warning, the figure lunged forward, its limbs twisting and contorting at impossible angles. Ben barely had time to react before it was upon him, its cold hands grabbing at his arm, pulling him toward it. The grip was like ice, and for a brief moment, everything went black. When Ben awoke, he found himself lying in the middle of the attic, disoriented. The figure was gone. The house was still and silent again, as though nothing had happened. But something had changed. He could feel it, deep in his bones. The atmosphere was thick with dread. The air itself seemed to whisper, faint voices echoing through the walls. Ben rushed downstairs, heart pounding, desperate to leave. As he stepped outside, he felt a cold gust of wind, like a breath brushing against his neck, followed by a faint whisper that chilled him to his core. "You're not supposed to leave." Ben's eyes darted around, but there was no one in sight. The voice had come from inside the house, but the door had slammed shut. The windows were sealed, and no one could have been there. He never went back. Every night since, he's been haunted by the whispers, hearing them in his sleep, hearing them when he's alone. Sometimes he feels the cold touch of fingers brushing against his skin, and sometimes he hears the faintest of footsteps behind him when no one is there. The house is empty now, but Ben knows better than anyone that something is still inside. Something is waiting for the right moment to return, to finish what it started.